Welcome to another insightful episode of Conversations with the Co-op, where we delve into crucial topics in special education. I'm your host, Jeffrey Lee, K-12 Special Education Coordinator for the Paul Bunyan Education Cooperative. Today we're going to focus on deaf, hard of hearing services and behaviors. You'll hear us use the term DHH a lot for this. Joining today is Laura Lind and Diane Schiffler-Dobe, our teachers and coordinators for the deaf and hard of hearing here in our cooperative. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Qualifying for DHH services is something that I don't think is really understood by a lot of people. So kind of setting the stage here, could you enlighten our audience on how students qualify for this category and the primary purpose of those DHH services in the educational setting?
Yeah, definitely. So to qualify, here in Minnesota, we actually have newborn hearing screenings. So as soon as a baby is born here, they do a screening for their hearing to see if they pass or fail. And if they do fail, they'll be referred to like an ear, nose, and throat doctor or an audiologist to do further testing. So it's really cool that Minnesota is actually one of the first states that started doing that, so we can hit the ground running with early intervention if needed. Basically, if a baby has hearing loss, then they're going to have to get a clinical audiologist on board just to do further testing to make sure we know what type of hearing loss they have and any sorts of hearing devices that might help with amplification needs and such.
So can I ask, how, when parents are going through this service or through this with their doctors and stuff, how is that like a referral process then to the audiologist, or are they kind of, they've got to be new to this, right? Like they probably have never experienced this before.
Right.
So kind of just real briefly, what does that kind of process look like?
Yep, definitely. So the hospital should put the referral in for the parents. Parents definitely need to follow up with those appointments where, if they have to go to the audiologist, it's highly encouraged. But if parents don't follow up within several weeks, I believe that the hospital reaches out to them to just be like, hey, we really want you to follow up. But it is out of our hands when it's in the parents' hands. So just getting them the information, not overloading them with information so they know, okay, what are my next steps?
It's really the first opportunity to get into this category, but where there's other opportunities then, right?
Yes, absolutely. Sometimes kids will pass their newborn hearing screening, but later, say they're in grade school, we're really trying to do a push for mandatory hearing screenings in school. It's not mandatory right now, it's just recommended. But there have been students that have been diagnosed later with hearing loss, and it's pretty detrimental because we have other things that go into play with that. Yes, if you're not hearing, you're unable to understand what's happening, learning. It causes developmental delays. There's a big umbrella.
And since hearing loss can be congenital, but it can also be caused by something else, right?
Correct, yep.
So those significant events and stuff might cause a school to say, we would like to investigate this further and look, because we feel that their hearing is impacting their ability to access education. Is that right?
Correct, yep. Actually, many times there will be, if they're really young, if the student's really young, sometimes people will think they have autism. Sometimes it's because they have a hearing level difference or hearing loss in the medical field. That's what they use as hearing loss, but now we're trying to go to hearing level difference or hearing differences.
I apologize.
No,
trying
that's
to
okay.
use more inclusive language.
I do it too. It's okay.
So you're saying that sometimes it gets misidentified as autism just because of that communication piece and hearing.
Right. There's barriers with that communication. So what they're seeing is, lashing out or really harmful, scary behaviors, but it's because they don't have the communication. So that's a very important part.
Which actually is a piece of what we're talking about today is how behaviors, I would say, kind of go around sometimes DHH. It isn't necessarily the cause of some of the behaviors, but the behaviors are different at times. And teasing out, is that related to DHH needs, or is that related to something else?
It depends on the diagnosis of the student. Of course, all students are different. We're all individuals. We all have different needs. Yeah, I mean, there are other things that could be happening too if it's something behavioral like autism, like I mentioned, but it could be something as simple as Now Minnesota is doing congenital cytomegalovirus screenings here, which also is a huge indicator for hearing loss as well. And not just when they're babies, because sometimes babies with CMV, that's the acronym, they will pass their newborn hearing screening, but then later in life they'll be diagnosed with hearing loss. And then we'll see, oh, they're really behind in education now, their social development is lacking. So hearing and being able to communicate is a huge part of our success for everybody.
So there's a lot of different causes for it, but when we come down to the Minnesota criteria for qualifying, like what's necessary to be eligible to receive services under the DHH category?
So once the child is seen by an audiologist, they have their tests done. Minnesota has criteria that we have to follow in order for them to qualify under the categorical disability of deaf and hard of hearing. Once that's done, once the audiogram is figured out, we have to start an initial evaluation for school. Typically, a lot of the hearing loss audiograms that we see, whether it's sensory neural hearing loss, conductive hearing loss, or mixed, there's 3 different types of hearing loss. Depending on the criteria, they will be in special education because of that hearing level difference, and that's when we figure out what other needs they'll need in school.
Diane, in your experience, what kinds of educationally intrusive behaviors are commonly associated with the needs of students who are categorized deaf and hard of hearing? How do these behaviors kind of differ from those unrelated to DHH needs?
Just because a child has educationally intrusive behavior, we have to be mindful that it's not always because of their hearing differences. They certainly can have other things happening that have nothing to do with their hearing loss. It is one thing if a student refuses to wear their hearing aids or use their school-provided FM system. Usually you see that late elementary through high school is where we see the challenges the most. When we all know that it helps them immensely wearing it, using it. At that age is when they start realizing they are different. It's what I call the identity crisis stage. These examples are more DHH related. It can be hit and miss. It is very helpful when the students understand their hearing differences and have the skills to be able to explain what their challenges are, as well as embracing and accepting who they are. This should start as soon as they're born. There's a lot of times, families are learning about, the impact of their hearing loss and how important it is to encourage the student to accept their own loss. But that is a difficult thing to do when the parents don't understand it or accept it themselves. And that takes time. It's a grieving process. But, there will be some that will benefit from social skills classes, mental health support, speech-language services. These behaviors are not solely DHH related, which is why it's important to have all the appropriate professional service providers involved and to collaborate together on the student needs.
Adding to that, when we're doing these evaluations, looking kind of comprehensively at the student. So just because we see a certain behavior, we don't just automatically attribute it to the disability category, but pull in specialists who understand behaviors or autism or something else to be able to tease out what is the root cause of this, right? And I definitely understand like those students who want to take off their hearing aids so that they can't hear, and because I don't want to look different, or I know that this is a real effective way of me not listening or whatever, that's more related to that disability as opposed to I don't want to go to class or I don't want to do this or that, right? So I understand that for sure. One thing that, as you were talking, it made me think of some of my past experience with like deaf culture and just really understanding like it's different. And most deaf individuals aren't born into deaf families. And so the family is learning this new way of experiencing life through their kids, and they're going to make mistakes along the way. And realizing that has consequences, good and bad, with that. Would you kind of agree like that's something that we see with some of these students where maybe their behaviors aren't necessarily because because they're trying to be bad, but because the exposure that they've had to certain things shaped who they are as an individual.
It kind of reminds me of learned helplessness a little bit, kind of going off of that when they get a certain response because of a certain behavior that they get. If they get the help in class from like their interpreter or from a different teacher, they're learning like, I'm not doing this on my own. I can't do it on my own, but I know I can do it if I have this help. So that learned helplessness is kind of, I see it quite a bit.
Yeah, and a lot of our services in special education, well, all of them are to try to push that independence, right? And we see that helplessness, so to speak, not just in this category, but in other ones too. You know, the student who has the emotional behavior disorders and has a paraprofessional with them all the time, they learn to depend on that person to provide them the prompts or provide them with the escape without actually developing the skill themselves. And so it's a really thin line we walk sometimes, providing them access to their education while trying to teach them those skills to be independent. And sometimes they're going to flop on either side of that line as we develop the whole child.
Yep.
So one last question for you, and I know we didn't talk a lot about this beforehand, but it's clear that addressing challenging behaviors with students categorized DHH that requires a unique approach. Can you kind of guide the listeners into steps to follow if a student categorized as DHH begins to exhibit behaviors that interfere with their education or the education of others? Like, what kind of strategies should we be using that might be effective, or when do you call the team together? When do you bring in other experts? So I just kind of want to hear your opinion on this.
Yeah, first I would definitely want to get as much information as I could about what's happening, whether that's from the teachers, interpreters, the student themselves, and whoever else is part of the student's team. I would like to get their input as well. Of course, just having a conversation with that student and team members would be fine for starters, but if it continues, then I would say we'd want to call a meeting in just to talk about it, to see what's going on, trying to find the triggers of why, those certain behaviors are happening.
And thinking about the families and the parents, obviously we want them involved in some of this process too. Mm-hmm. Where does the education that we provide students extend kind of to the families, and what's kind of our limitation there? Because I know it would be great if we could provide more information to parents, and some of them are really like sponges and want to absorb it. Others are grieving still and still, not fully accepting the limitations that their child might have. So, where are we kind of at with families in all of this too?
So typically when it's early intervention, so when they're really little, that's when you try and, hit the ground running and really provide the family with the foundational tools that they need. Sometimes it might be overwhelming, but the way that you approach it is just, as friendly as you can be. We're here together, we're working together, but really putting it in the families, letting them decide what we want to work on, what we want to see improve or progress. But then when they're in school, I feel like we do share things. There are certain events and things with family and that we'd send home, like with the students, but we really would love if we could have a parent group.
I want to thank Diane and Laura for shedding some light on the intersection of kind of DHH services and behaviors. The conversation has really been enlightening, and I'm sure our listeners have gained some valuable insights. Join us again on Conversations with the Co-op for more discussions on these crucial topics. That wraps up this episode, so stay tuned for more topics coming soon.